I've never liked hospitals. The sterile white walls, the strange smell of disinfectant, the low hum of machines, it all makes my skin crawl. Yet there I was, standing at the entrance of St. Mark's General, a hospital on the outskirts of town, late at night. My best friend Steve had been in an accident, and I came to visit him after getting off a long shift at work. The last thing I wanted was to walk into that creepy building, but I had no choice. It was already past visiting hours, but I figured I could sneak in. I knew Steve would appreciate the company, and the thought of him being alone in a place like that didn't sit well with me. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and walked through the automatic doors, which opened with an eerie, almost ghostly hiss. Inside, the front desk was empty. No nurses, no security guard. It felt strange. Shouldn't there always be someone at the front desk, especially in a hospital? The fluorescent lights above me flickered slightly, casting shadows that danced across the tiled floor. I shivered. "Just get in and get out," I whispered to myself, as if saying it out loud would make it easier. I had been here once before, so I knew where Steve's room was. He was in the east wing, on the second floor. I headed towards the elevator at the end of the hall, hoping it still worked. My footsteps echoed as I walked, and every little sound seemed magnified in the silence. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant creak of doors, even my breathing seemed too loud. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the button, and to my surprise, it lit up immediately. I guess I expected something in this old place to be broken, but no, the elevator worked fine. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the second floor. As the doors closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The ride up was smooth, but the elevator made a strange clicking sound that made me a little uneasy. I was relieved when the doors opened, and I quickly stepped out into the hallway. The second floor looked just like the first, long, empty, and unsettlingly quiet. I glanced around for signs of life but saw no one, not even a nurse making rounds. My anxiety started to grow. I walked down the hallway, counting the room numbers as I went. Steve was in room 223. The numbers seemed to go on forever, but finally, I reached his door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What if he was asleep? I didn't want to wake him, but something inside me pushed me to open the door. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of a heart monitor. It beeped steadily, the only sound in the room. Steve was lying in the bed, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling slowly. Relief washed over me. He looked peaceful at least. I pulled up a chair next to his bed and sat down. The room felt cold, and I rubbed my hands together to warm them up. I sat in silence for a while, just listening to the steady beep of the monitor and Steve's breathing. After a few minutes, I noticed something strange. The heart monitor's beeping slowed down, then sped up, then slowed again. I glanced at Steve, but he still looked the same, completely still, his face calm. But the monitor kept acting weird, as if something was interfering with it. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I stood up and looked around the room, my eyes scanning the shadows. Something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, and a strange pressure built in my chest, like the room was closing in on me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. It felt like something was keeping me there, holding me in place. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned towards the sound, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. There was nothing there. But the whisper came again, a soft, eerie voice I couldn't understand. It sounded like it was calling my name. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice shaking. The whisper stopped. I stood frozen, my eyes darting around the room, trying to find the source of the sound. But all I could see were shadows, shifting and moving as if they had a life of their own. The beeping of the heart monitor sped up again, almost in time with my own racing heartbeat. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked, no one was there. The door just stood open, swinging slightly on its hinges. The hallway beyond was pitch black. I took a step back, my hands shaking. I needed to leave. Now. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out of the room, my feet moving faster than my mind. The hallway was even darker than before, and the lights overhead flickered more intensely, casting long, eerie shadows. I hurried towards the elevator, but as I got closer, I saw that the doors were open, and the inside was pitch black. I stopped in my tracks. The elevator shouldn't be open. It should have gone back down after I got off. I stared at it, my breath coming in short, quick gasps. I didn't want to get in. Something about it felt wrong. Like it was waiting for me, like it wanted me to step inside. I turned and ran for the stairwell instead. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls as I pushed open the heavy door and bolted down the stairs. The air in the stairwell was damp and smelled of mildew, and every creak of the steps made my stomach twist with fear. I was halfway down when I heard it again, the whisper, but this time it was louder, closer, like it was right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one was there. The stairwell was empty, but the whisper kept following me, growing louder with every step. I ran faster, my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel something behind me, something cold and dark, chasing me down the stairs. The air around me grew heavier, thicker, as if the walls were closing in. When I finally reached the bottom floor, I burst through the door and into the lobby. The front desk was still empty, the lights still flickering. I didn't stop. I ran straight for the exit, my mind screaming at me to get out of there. As I reached the automatic doors, they slid open with a slow, agonizing hiss. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, my heart racing. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, and I finally slowed down, my body trembling with fear and adrenaline. I looked back at the hospital, its windows dark and looming against the night sky. The building looked like a giant, silent monster, watching me, waiting. I turned away and started walking towards my car, my mind racing with questions. What had I just experienced? Was it real? Was something wrong with that hospital, or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? As I got into my car and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something dark, something that didn't want to let me go. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still feel it, watching, waiting. I don't think I'll ever step foot in a hospital again. Not after that night, not after what I saw and what I heard. There's something wrong with St. Mark's General, something evil. And I don't think it's done with me yet. I just hope it never finds me again. It was my first day working as a night nurse at St. Michael's Hospital. I was nervous but excited. The hospital was big and old, with long hallways and many rooms. I stepped inside, feeling the cool air hit my face. The receptionist, a woman named Carol, smiled at me. "Welcome. You'll do great," she said. Her voice was warm, but there was something in her eyes like a hint of worry. "Thanks, I hope so," I replied with a nervous laugh. She handed me my badge and a set of keys. "You'll be working the 3rd floor tonight. It's usually quiet, but if you need anything, just call down to the main desk." I nodded and took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. As the doors opened, a cold draft hit me, and I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with faded photographs of doctors and nurses from decades ago, their black and white faces watching me as I walked by. The silence was unsettling, and the overhead lights flickered slightly. I made my way to the nurses' station, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The station was small, just a desk, a few chairs and a computer. A large clock on the wall ticked loudly, making the silence even more noticeable. As I settled in, I heard faint footsteps coming from the far end of the hallway. I looked up, expecting to see a doctor or another nurse, but the hallway was empty. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the old building settling. I spent the next hour checking on the few patients admitted to this floor. They were all asleep, their rooms dark and quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors. Everything seemed normal, but the silence felt heavy, like the air itself was watching me. Around midnight, I was sitting at the nurses' station going over some charts when I heard a faint whisper. I froze, listening closely. The sound was coming from down the hall. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no answer. I walked slowly toward the end of the hallway, the whispering growing louder with each step. It was coming from room 307, a room that should have been empty. I hesitated before knocking softly on the door. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. My hand hovered over the doorknob and I decided to open it. The room was dark, only a sliver of moonlight creeping through the curtains. The bed was neatly made, and the room appeared empty. But the whispering hadn't stopped. It was clearer now, almost like someone was speaking directly into my ear. I stepped closer to the bed. and that's when I noticed it. The air felt colder near the center of the room, and there, sitting in the corner, was a shadowy figure. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure remained. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the whispering stopped. The figure vanished as soon as the lights came back on. I stood there, heart racing, trying to process what I had just seen. Maybe I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. That had to be it. I quickly left room 307, pulling the door shut behind me. My legs felt weak, and I hurried back to the nurse's station. I sat down, trying to catch my breath. The hospital was old. Maybe there were electrical problems. That could explain the flickering lights. But the whispering? The shadow? I glanced at the clock. It was only a little past midnight, and I still had several hours left on my shift. I needed to get through this. A few minutes later, the phone rang, startling me. I answered it, my voice shaky. "Nurse's station. How can I help you?" There was only static on the other end, followed by a low, distorted voice. "Come to me." I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling. I looked around, feeling paranoid, like someone was watching me. This hospital had a history. I remembered Carol mentioning it when I applied for the job. Rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained deaths, and apparitions had followed St. Michael's for years. I couldn't sit still. I had to do something to take my mind off whatever was happening, so I decided to check on the patients again. Maybe focusing on work would help me shake the eerie feeling crawling up my spine. As I walked down the hall, I glanced at room 307. The door was still closed, but I could feel something on the other side, waiting. I forced myself to look away and continued my rounds. Each patient I checked on was fine, fast asleep and unaware of the strange happenings around them. But when I reached the last room on the floor, room 312, something felt off. The patient, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, was supposed to be stable. But when I opened the door, I found him sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Thompson, are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the same corner I had seen the shadow in earlier. "Mr. Thompson?" I repeated, reaching out to touch his arm. He finally turned to me, his voice trembling. "She's here." "Who's here?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "The woman. She's always watching. She never leaves." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What woman, Mr. Thompson?" He pointed toward the corner. "She comes every night," she whispers to me, says she's trapped here. I looked toward the corner, half expecting to see the shadow again, but there was nothing. I left Mr. Thompson's room, my mind racing. Who was the woman he had seen? Was she connected to the whispering I had heard earlier? I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. As I sat back down at the nurse's station, I noticed an old binder labeled incident reports sitting on the desk. I had never paid attention to it before, but now I felt compelled to open it. Inside were reports dating back decades. Most were typical: falls, minor injuries, patient complaints. But then I came across a series of reports from the 1970s. Several patients had complained about seeing a woman in their rooms at night, whispering to them, watching them. The more I read, the more I realized these incidents all occurred on the third floor. And each patient described the same woman: long dark hair, pale skin, and hollow eyes. They all claimed she would stand in the corner of their rooms, just watching, before disappearing into the shadows. I felt sick. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was wrong with this floor, and it had been happening for years. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. I stood up, my body tense, as the whispering started once more. This time, it wasn't coming from room 307. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, and there at the end of the hallway was the woman. She was barely visible, her figure dark and shadowy, but I could see her long hair and hollow eyes. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me. I wanted to run, but my feet were frozen in place. The woman's presence was overwhelming, her hollow eyes locked on mine. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Help me, help, ma'am." Finally, I found the strength to move. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and ran toward the elevator. I pressed the button repeatedly, my hands shaking. When the doors finally opened, I jumped inside and hit the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, the whispering stopped and the air felt lighter. When the doors opened, I rushed out, barely acknowledging Carol as I sped past the reception desk. "Are you all right?" she called after me, but I didn't stop. I needed to get out of that building. The next day, I quit my job at St. Michael's Hospital. I couldn't go back, not after what I had seen. I later found out that the woman who haunted the third floor had been a patient in the 1970s. She had died under mysterious circumstances, her body never found. Some say she's still there, trapped, waiting for someone to help her. I never went back to find out. My name is Ava. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, but what happened that night changed me forever. It all started with my shift at St. Catherine's Hospital, an old building that always had a strange vibe about it. The walls were peeling and the lights flickered more often than they should, but it was my job and I couldn't be picky. I had been working there for a few years now as a night nurse. Most of the time, it was quiet, too quiet sometimes, but I liked it that way, until one particular night when everything changed. The hospital was almost empty that night. There were only a few patients scattered across different rooms, and my job was to check on them every few hours. Around midnight, I was assigned to monitor the West Wing, a section of the hospital that hadn't been fully operational in years. Most of the rooms there were closed off, except for one, room 306. It was an old man, Mr. Peterson. He was a quiet, frail man who rarely spoke. His family didn't visit much, and he didn't seem to care. When I entered his room to check his vitals, he was just sitting there, staring blankly out the window. "Everything all right, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, trying to make small talk. He slowly turned his head towards me, his eyes empty and hollow, like he wasn't really looking at me. "They're here," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's here?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He just turned back towards the window, silent once again. I finished checking his vitals and left the room feeling uneasy. The halls of the West Wing were darker than usual that night. I could hear the faint hum of the hospital's machinery, but it seemed distant. As I walked past room 306, I glanced inside, but Mr. Peterson was still staring out the window. I decided to check on the other patients. Room 301 had a woman named Mrs. Thompson who was recovering from surgery. When I entered, she looked at me with wide eyes. "You have to get me out of here," she said, her voice shaking. "Why? What's wrong?" I asked, concerned. "They're watching us. They come at night when it's quiet," she whispered, glancing towards the door. I felt a shiver run through me. I had heard rumors about the West Wing being haunted, but I never paid much attention. "Who's watching?" I pressed, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I comforted her as best as I could before moving on. Next, I visited room 302. Mr. Alvarez was a grumpy old man who often complained, but tonight he was unusually quiet. When I walked in, he was staring at the wall, a look of terror on his face. "They're coming for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's coming for you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The shadows. "They creep in when the lights flicker," he replied, pointing towards the light fixture. My heart raced. I didn't want to believe him, but the atmosphere was growing heavier, darker. I made my way back to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the unease. As I logged my notes, the lights flickered above me, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. I glanced at the clock, 1:30 a.m. I needed to check on Mr. Peterson. When I arrived at room 306, the door creaked open, and I stepped inside. Mr. Peterson was no longer at the window. I looked around, confused, until I saw him in the corner of the room, hunched over. He was whispering to himself. "Mr. Peterson?" I called out, but he didn't respond. I approached him cautiously. His back was to me, and he seemed to be talking to someone or something I couldn't see. Suddenly, he turned around, his face pale and his eyes wide. "They've come for me," he said, shaking. "They want me to join them." I stepped back, my heart pounding. Who wants you?" He raised a trembling finger, pointing to the dark corner of the room. "They're right there." I squinted into the shadows, but there was nothing, just the darkness. "Mr. Peterson, it's all right. You're safe," I tried to reassure him. "No," he screamed, backing away until he hit the wall. "You don't understand. They take you." I felt a sudden cold breeze, and the lights flickered again. Panic gripped me. "I need to get help," I said, turning to leave the room. but before I could reach the door, I heard a low whisper echoing through the darkness. "Join us. Join us." My heart raced as I pushed open the door and stumbled into the hallway. The hospital felt different now, the air thick with dread. I rushed to the nurse's station, ready to call for backup, but as I reached for the phone, I froze. All the lights in the West Wing went out, leaving only the emergency exit signs glowing ominously. I could hear soft footsteps echoing in the hall, getting closer. "Help!" I yelled, but my voice felt small and lost in the darkness. I looked towards room 306, and the door was now wide open, as if inviting me back in. "Help me," I heard a voice whisper, but it wasn't Mr. Peterson's. It was coming from the shadow. I turned and ran. My heart raced as I dashed down the hall towards the main part of the hospital. I could hear the whispers growing louder, the footsteps following me. "Join us." I burst through the double doors into the brightly lit lobby. The sudden light felt like a relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still there, lurking just out of sight. I glanced back towards the West Wing, where the shadows seemed to shift and rise. A few nurses were gathered at the desk, looking up at me in surprise. "Ava, what's wrong?" one of them asked. I think something's wrong with the West Wing," I stammered, still catching my breath. "Patients are saying they see things." Before I could explain further, a loud crash echoed from the West Wing, followed by frantic shouting. We all jumped up, looking at each other in fear. "Let's go check it out," one of the nurses said, her voice steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We made our way back toward the West Wing, but as we approached, the air grew colder. The lights flickered ominously again, casting strange shadows along the walls. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. When we reached the entrance, we found it strangely quiet. The nurses hesitated, glancing at each other. "Maybe we should just call security," another nurse suggested. "No," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "We have to see if everyone is all right." We stepped into the darkness of the West Wing, our flashlights cutting through the shadows. As we moved down the hall, I could hear whispers again, echoing around us. "Join us." I shivered and kept moving, leading the way to room 306. When we reached it, the door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. Mr. Peterson was back at the window, but this time, he was not alone. Shadows danced around him, swirling and twisting, their forms indistinct. "They're here," he said, not looking at us. "What's happening?" I asked, terrified. "Join us." The shadows whispered again, this time more insistent. Suddenly the lights flickered violently, and the shadows surged forward, engulfing Mr. Peterson. He screamed, a sound filled with terror, and then fell silent. I couldn't move, frozen in fear as the shadows swirled around us, closing in. The other nurses screamed, and we all stumbled back. "Run," I shouted, turning to flee down the hall. We bolted back toward the lobby, hearts racing. The whispers were deafening now, filling my mind with dread. "Join us." Just as we reached the main area, the lights flickered once more, and I felt a cold grip around my ankle. I fell to the ground, looking back to see a shadowy hand reaching for me. "No!" I screamed, pulling myself free and scrambling to my feet. The nurses pulled me along, and we burst through the doors into the main part of the hospital, breathless and terrified. We quickly called security and the doctors, but when they arrived, the West Wing was eerily quiet again. "Where are the patients?" one of the doctors asked, looking around. They were right here," I said, my voice shaking. "Mr. Peterson, it was just he." We rushed back to the West Wing, but when we arrived, all the rooms were empty. The lights were back on, and everything looked normal, but it felt wrong. The doctors and security searched the area, but they found nothing. The patients had vanished. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had taken hold of the West Wing. I transferred to another hospital, hoping to escape the memories. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers in my mind, begging me to join them. Chat G.